The coffee in the break room was still warm when I noticed the footer missing from the draft policy document someone had left on the printer. Small thing, right? Except that footer contained the regulatory compliance stamp. The kind that makes everything inside the document legally binding. The kind that, without it, turns 50 pages of corporate policy into expensive scratch paper. I'm Naomi Lake, and I'd spent 6 years as the senior compliance architect at Global Technologies. Not the flashy title that gets you invited to leadership offsites, but the kind that keeps the company from bleeding money in regulatory fines. I was the one who made sure every policy update, every procedural change, every shift in our data handling practices could survive a legal audit. And I was very, very good at it. My desk sat in a corner of the 4th floor, wedged between risk management and internal audit. Close enough to legal that I could walk over when interpretation questions came up, far enough from executive row that most VPs forgot I existed until they needed a signature. That's how specialized roles work in most corporations. Your invisible infrastructure. The electrical wiring in the walls. Nobody thinks about you until the lights go out. I built the entire compliance framework Global Technologies used. Not inherited it, not revised someone else's work, built it from nothing. When I started, the company was using a patchwork of outdated policies held together with good intentions and crossed fingers. 3 different regulatory standards, 2 international frameworks, and nobody who understood how they interconnected. I spent my first year just mapping the landscape. Creating matrices that showed which operational procedures triggered which compliance requirements. Building timelines that tracked when various certifications needed renewal. Developing a master document architecture that could flex when regulations changed without collapsing the whole system. It was meticulous work. Boring work, if you didn't understand what failure looked like. But I understood. I'd come from a smaller firm that had imploded under regulatory fines. Watched good people lose their jobs because leadership treated compliance like expensive decoration instead of critical infrastructure. That memory kept me careful. Kept me building systems with redundancy and documentation. Then came Tuesday. VP of Operations, Steven Vandermeer, called me into his office with that specific smile executives use when they're about to tell you something they think is reasonable. Steven was new to Global Technologies, only 8 months in. Came from a consumer products company where compliance meant checking boxes on safety labels. He had that particular confidence that comes from not knowing what you don't know. Naomi, we're making some changes to the Q4 policy revision project. Bringing in some fresh perspective. Fresh perspective. That's corporate speak for someone cheaper, usually. Or someone who plays golf with the right people. Mallory Weston from marketing is going to take the lead on documentation, he continued, already looking back at his screen. She writes cleaner than you. More accessible. He actually laughed. A short bark of amusement, like he'd just told a clever joke at a networking mixer. No offense, but your stuff reads like a legal textbook. We need something people will actually read. 6 years of work. 6 years of building the architecture that kept Global Technologies compliant across 4 regulatory bodies and 3 international frameworks. Dismissed because someone's prose sparkled in a product brief. I could have explained right then. Could have walked him through why compliance documentation reads dense, because every sentence needs to map to a specific legal standard. Every procedural description has to withstand scrutiny from regulators who are actively looking for gaps. You're not writing marketing copy. You're building a legal defense that has to hold up under hostile examination. But I didn't. Because people like Steven don't hear that explanation when you offer it voluntarily. They hear defensiveness. They hear someone protecting their territory. The words bounce off them like rain off glass. I didn't argue. People who argue in those moments never realize they've already lost. I just nodded, gathered the project files I'd been preparing for the last 2 months, and walked back to my desk. Quietly. Professionally. The way you do when you know something nobody else in the room has figured out yet. My colleague in risk management, a sharp woman named Chloe Park, caught my expression as I passed her desk. What happened? Got replaced on the policy project. Marketing's taking over. Chloe's eyes widened. Marketing? For regulatory compliance documentation? Apparently my writing isn't accessible enough. Jesus. Does Steven understand? No, I said simply. he doesn't. Here's what Steven Vandermeer didn't understand about compliance architecture. It's not just writing clear sentences about data retention policies. It's understanding that every word connects to a legal framework. Every procedural description has to map to a specific regulatory standard. Every timeline has to acknowledge jurisdiction-specific requirements. You're not writing a document. You're building a legally defensible structure that stands between the company and a multi-million-dollar liability. And I was the only person at Global Technologies with the Certified Regulatory Compliance Professional credential active in my name. Not Steven. Not Mallory. Not anyone in legal or operations. Just me. The CRCP isn't some weekend certification you pick up online. It's a 2-year professional credential requiring a master's degree in a related field, 18 months of supervised compliance work, and a brutal 3-part examination that tests everything from regulatory interpretation to risk assessment methodology. The pass rate hovers around 38%. I'd taken it twice. Failed the first time on the risk modeling section. Passed the second time and spent the next 4 years maintaining it through continuing education requirements and annual recertification. More importantly, my CRCP registration listed me as the authorized compliance officer for Global Technologies regulatory filings. That meant any policy documentation we submitted for official review had to carry my personal certification. Not a department approval. Not a legal sign-off. My name, my credential number, my professional liability on the line. Steven didn't know that. Why would he? It was technical detail. Infrastructure stuff. The kind of thing that doesn't come up in executive briefings. You probably know where this is going. Maybe you've seen it happen at your own workplace. The quiet technical person gets sidelined, and suddenly systems start showing cracks nobody noticed before. It's almost predictable. Almost boring how often it happens. Except this time, there was a timeline. The new policy framework was due for submission to our external legal review team by Friday. After that, it would go to the Regulatory Liaison Office for pre-approval before the January compliance window opened. Miss that window, and Global Technologies would be operating under outdated policies for another full quarter. Which meant potential non-compliance findings. Which meant fines starting at $100,000 and escalating from there, depending on what violations turned up in the meantime. But here's the detail that mattered: any policy documentation submitted for regulatory review had to be certified by an active CRCP credential holder. Not signed off by legal. Not approved by a VP. Certified by someone whose name appeared in the National Registry, confirming they'd personally validated every compliance mapping in the document. I was the only CRCP on staff. And as of Tuesday afternoon, I was no longer on the project. I sat at my desk that afternoon and thought about my options. I could warn Steven. Walk back into his office and explain the credential requirement. Offer to stay on in a supporting role. Save him from the disaster he'd just set in motion. That would be the professional thing to do. The collaborative team player approach. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the laugh. That casual bark of amusement when he dismissed 6 years of specialized work. Maybe it was the fact that Steven had been at Global Technologies for 8 months and had never once asked me to explain what I actually did. Never showed curiosity about the systems that kept the company operational. He'd walked past my desk dozens of times, and I don't think he'd ever looked up from his phone long enough to make eye contact. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I was just tired of being invisible until something broke. Wednesday morning, I did something small. I logged into the regulatory portal and updated my internal assignment status. Removed myself from the Q4 policy project. Added a note that my certification was no longer available for that initiative. Timestamped it. Downloaded the confirmation. Then I went to my file cabinet and pulled out every working draft, every compliance matrix, every mapping document I'd created over the past 2 months. Put them in a folder. Took that folder home. I wasn't hiding anything. If anyone asked, I'd explain exactly where everything was. But nobody asked. Because Steven and his fresh perspective assumed policy work was like any other writing project. Plug in a new person, get similar output. Simple substitution. The rest of Wednesday passed normally. I worked on a safety protocol update for the manufacturing division. Reviewed some vendor compliance documentation. Had lunch with Chloe, who asked if I was okay. I'm fine, I said. And I was. Calm, actually. Clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in months. There's something clarifying about watching someone make a mistake you could prevent but choosing not to. It puts things in perspective. Thursday morning, I arrived early and checked my email. Nothing unusual. Stephen hadn't reached out. Mallory hadn't asked for transition documentation. It was like the project had simply moved forward without me, smooth as silk. Around 10, I saw Mallory in the hallway, carrying a printed document thick enough to be the policy draft. She looked confident. Energized, even. The way people do when they've been given a high-profile assignment and think they're crushing it. I didn't stop her. Didn't ask how it was going. Just nodded politely and kept walking. Thursday afternoon, I heard through a colleague that Mallory was making great progress on the documentation. Apparently, she'd streamlined a lot of the language. Made it more reader-friendly. Cut out some of the dense regulatory cross-references that cluttered up the flow. The colleague, a junior attorney named Wesley Burke, mentioned this in the break room while making tea. Have you seen Mallory's revision of the policy framework? It's actually readable. Like, I understood it on the first pass. That's great, I said neutrally. I mean, no offense to your version, but it was pretty dense. This feels more like something you'd actually want to implement. I smiled. Sipped my coffee. Accessibility is important. Wesley nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. Stephen made a good call bringing in a communications professional. I didn't say anything. What would I say? That readability and legal defensibility aren't the same thing? That Mallory was stripping out the load-bearing walls while admiring the new paint color? That Wesley's ability to understand the document on first pass probably meant it was missing critical technical specifications? None of that would land. Not yet. So I finished my coffee and went back to work. That evening, I got an email from our external legal review team. Just a courtesy note, asking if I'd be available for a brief call Friday morning to walk through the certification checklist before they started their review. Standard procedure. They always coordinated with the CRCP on file to make sure everything was properly structured before they billed hours for the deep analysis. The email came from Helena Moss, the lead partner at Whitmore and Associates, the firm Global Technologies had used for regulatory review for the past decade. Helena was in her late 50s, had been practicing compliance law since the regulatory frameworks were first established, and had absolutely zero patience for corner cutting. I'd worked with Helena on every major policy update for 6 years. She trusted my work. More importantly, she understood the difference between documentation that looked good and documentation that would survive regulatory scrutiny. I replied that I was no longer assigned to that project, and they should coordinate with Stephen Vandermeer's office directly. Polite. Professional. Accurate. Then I forwarded my response to my personal email. Documentation. Just in case. Here's what happens when leadership treats specialized roles like interchangeable parts. They don't just lose the person. They lose the invisible infrastructure that person maintained. The professional relationships, the procedural knowledge, the understanding of which roles matter and which ones are decorative. It all walks out the door quietly, and nobody notices until something needs it. Helena would notice immediately. She'd ask for the CRCP certification. She'd want to see the compliance matrices. She'd look for the regulatory cross-references that had to be present for the document to be legally valid. And when she didn't find them, she'd stop the entire process. Not because she was vindictive. Because that was literally her job. Whitmore and Associates got paid to catch compliance failures before they became regulatory disasters. Helena had built her reputation on being thorough. She wasn't going to rubber stamp something that would get her client fined. Friday morning arrived. I came in, made coffee, caught up on some backlog work for other departments. Around 10, I saw Stephen's calendar suddenly clear for the rest of the day. Saw several meeting invitations go out to legal. To finance. To our external review team. My phone stayed silent until 11:30. Then Stephen appeared at my desk. No smile this time. His face had that tight expression executives get when they've just discovered a problem they don't know how to fix. Naomi. My office. Now. I saved my work. Closed my laptop. stood up slowly. Chloe caught my eye from across the room, eyebrows raised in question. I gave her the smallest shrug and followed Stephen down the hallway. The conference room was fuller than I expected. Stephen at the head of the table, looking like a man who'd just discovered his parachute, was decorative. Mallory in the corner, pale and holding a marked-up document like a shield. Two attorneys from our legal team, Wesley Burke and the senior counsel, a woman named Diane Fletcher who'd been with Global Technologies since before I arrived. And on the video screen, the lead partner from our external review firm, Helena Moss, looking exactly as unimpressed as I'd expected. Helena spoke first. Ms. Lake. Thank you for joining us. I understand there's been some organizational restructuring on the policy project. That's correct, I said. Calm. Clear. Just the facts. We've received the draft documentation for review, Helena continued. And I need to clarify something. There's no CRCP certification attached to this submission. Which means we cannot proceed with the legal review. Which means this document cannot be submitted to the Regulatory Liaison Office. Stephen jumped in. We have a full legal team review. Surely that's sufficient for... No. Helena's voice was courtroom flat. Regulatory Standard 47B, Section 12. Any policy framework governing data handling, financial reporting, or operational compliance must be certified by a credentialed compliance professional before external review. Not approved. Certified. The distinction is legal, not semantic. Diane Fletcher, the senior counsel, cleared her throat. Can we bring in an external CRCP as a contractor? Timeline? Helena asked. Submission deadline is today, Diane said quietly. Then no. A contracted CRCP would need a minimum of 3 business days to conduct a proper audit and certification of a document this size. And that's assuming they have availability and can be on board through your systems immediately. Most reputable professionals I know are booked weeks out. Stephen turned to me. You could actually watch him recalculating. Watch the moment he realized that invisible infrastructure actually mattered. Naomi. You can still certify this, right? Just review what Mallory's put together and sign off? I kept my voice level. Professional. I can review the document and provide an assessment. But I won't certify something I haven't personally validated against the compliance framework. That would put my credential at risk. And based on what I'm hearing, there are structural issues that would require significant revision. How significant? Diane asked. She already knew the answer, I could tell. She just wanted it on record. I pulled out my tablet. Opened my notes. I'd actually reviewed Mallory's draft the night before, after someone had left a copy on the shared drive. Professional curiosity. The current draft removes 17 mandatory regulatory cross-references. It consolidates 3 separate procedural timelines into one general description, which violates jurisdiction-specific requirements in 2 states. And it's missing the entire appendix mapping data retention policies to Federal Standard 902, which means it's not actually compliant with current law. Silence in the room. The kind that feels like air pressure dropping. Mallory spoke up, defensive. Those cross-references made the document hard to read. I was trying to make it accessible. That's what Stephen asked for, something people would actually read and implement. You made it legally worthless, Helena said from the screen. Not cruel. Just factual. Ms. Lake, if you were to conduct a full compliance audit and certification of the existing draft, what's your timeline? I considered. Assuming I work over the weekend and prioritize this above all other projects, I could have a certified document ready for submission by end of business Monday. But that misses today's deadline. Correct, Helena said. Which means Global Technologies will not have updated policies in place for the January compliance window. Mr. Vandermeer, do you understand what that means operationally? Stephen looked like he was doing math in his head he didn't want to finish. We'd be operating under last year's framework. Which expired in November, Diane added quietly. We'd be in technical non-compliance for the entire quarter. If there's an audit. When there's an audit, Helena corrected. Your sector has mandatory quarterly audits. One is scheduled for late January. If you're operating without current certified policies, you're looking at baseline fines around $200,000, plus escalation penalties for any operational violations they find. Could easily reach 7 figures depending on severity. You know that moment when everyone in a room realizes they've been swimming in the deep end without checking if anyone brought life jackets? That's what this felt like. You could see it on their faces. The sudden understanding that this wasn't a formatting problem. This was structural failure with expensive consequences. Wesley Burke, the junior attorney, spoke up. Can we request an extension from the Regulatory Liaison Office? Explain the circumstances? Helena's expression didn't change. You can try. But they're not obligated to grant it. The compliance windows are published 18 months in advance specifically so organizations have time to prepare. And explaining that you reassigned your only credentialed compliance professional to, what was it, marketing? She glanced at her notes. That's not going to inspire confidence in your operational competence. Stephen's face had gone from tight to pale. He turned back to me, and I watched him consciously reset his expression. Trying to find the tone that would fix this. Naomi, what do you need to make this work? Wrong question. But he didn't know that yet. I need to understand my role here, I said. Am I being asked to provide consulting advice on a project I'm not assigned to? Or am I being reassigned to the project? Reassigned, Stephen said immediately. Obviously. This is critical infrastructure work. Then I need that in writing, I said. Project assignment documentation. Restoration of my access to all policy development systems. And a clear reporting structure that doesn't run through Mallory or anyone else who might want to streamline my work for accessibility. Diane was already typing on her laptop. I can draft that now. And I need carte blanche on the revision process, I continued. If I'm certifying this document, I'm building it to regulatory standards, not marketing aesthetics. No edits, no shortcuts, no executive overrides on technical requirements. Stephen nodded. He would have agreed to anything at this point. Done. What else? I paused. Looked at the screen where Helena Moss was watching this play out with the patient expression of someone who'd seen this exact scenario a dozen times. I need to speak with legal and finance privately. About longer-term structural issues. That got attention. What issues? Stephen asked. The ones that made this situation possible in the first place. Stephen opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Diane nodded. That's reasonable. Stephen, Mallory, we'll reconvene later. It wasn't a question. Stephen stood up, gestured for Mallory to follow, and left the conference room looking like a man who'd just watched his career trajectory flatten unexpectedly. 20 minutes later, I was in a smaller conference room with just Diane Fletcher, Wesley Burke, and Helena still on screen. The door was closed. The atmosphere was different, less performative, more strategic. Walk us through it, Diane said. I pulled up an organizational chart on the screen. Global Technologies has exactly one credentialed compliance professional on staff. Me. And my role has no structural protection. Any VP can remove me from projects, reassign my work, or decide I'm not necessary. Which creates catastrophic risk. Recommend a fix, Helena said from the screen. 3 things. First, my role reports directly to the General Counsel, not operations. No executive override on compliance decisions. Second, any policy or procedural documentation that requires regulatory certification cannot be reassigned without my written approval. Third, we bring in an external compliance auditor on a quarterly basis to provide oversight and backup certification capacity. Diane and Wesley looked at each other. Diane nodded slowly. That's reasonable. I'll draft the structural change proposal for the executive team. And one more thing, I said. I want this in my contract. Not just policy. If I'm the single point of failure for regulatory compliance, I need ironclad protection from exactly what happened this week. Helena actually smiled on the screen. Smart. I've seen too many compliance professionals thrown under the bus when something goes wrong. Protect yourself structurally, or you'll end up being the scapegoat when the next VP decides compliance is negotiable. Wesley looked uncomfortable. Shouldn't we be focusing on the immediate crisis? We have a Monday deadline for the document. The immediate crisis is a symptom, I said. The structural problem is the disease. If we don't fix both, this happens again in 6 months with a different VP and a different project. Diane nodded. Agreed. Wesley, draft the contract amendments. I'll handle the organizational structure proposal. Helena, can you provide a recommendation letter supporting the external auditor arrangement? Already writing it, Helena said. And Naomi, for what it's worth, you handled this correctly. A lot of professionals in your position would have folded immediately when Stephen showed up looking desperate. The fact that you're using this leverage to fix the system instead of just protecting yourself in the moment says good things about your judgment. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. The meeting broke up. I went back to my desk and pulled out my personal files, the ones I'd taken home Wednesday. Started rebuilding the policy document from scratch. Not from Mallory's draft. That was unsalvageable. The compliance architecture was wrong at a foundational level. Trying to patch it would be like trying to repair a collapsed building by painting the rubble. I went back to my original working files, updated with the latest regulatory guidance that had come out in the past week. Started from the ground up. Every cross-reference mapped. Every timeline jurisdiction-specific. Every procedural requirement tied directly to its legal foundation. It was meticulous work. The kind that takes focus and can't be rushed without introducing errors. I worked late Friday. Came in Saturday morning and didn't leave until midnight. Came back Sunday at 8 and worked through until evening. Chloe texted me Sunday afternoon. Are you actually at the office right now? Rebuilding the policy framework. Jesus. Do you need help? Unless you have a CRCP credential I don't know about, not really. But thanks. You know you could have just let this burn, right? Let Stephen figure out how to explain missing the compliance window? I thought about that. Yeah. But then Global Technologies takes the hit. The audit penalties, the operational restrictions, the reputation damage. And I like this company. I like most of the people here. It's not their fault Stephen doesn't understand compliance architecture. You're nicer than I am. Maybe. Or maybe I just want to make sure the system gets fixed so this doesn't happen again. That too. Monday morning, I submitted the certified document to Helena's team. She acknowledged receipt within 20 minutes. Initial review looks solid. We'll have the full assessment by end of day. The document came back with minor notes, 3 clarification requests, 1 timeline that needed adjusting for a recent regulatory update I'd missed. Small things. Fixable in an hour. By 3 p.m., Helena had signed off. This is certifiable. Clean work, Naomi. I'm submitting to the Regulatory Liaison Office now. The document was accepted into the January compliance window at 4:30, with 90 minutes to spare before the hard deadline. I sent a brief email to Diane and Stephen. Policy framework certified and submitted. Documentation attached. Stephen replied within 5 minutes. Thank you. Can we meet tomorrow morning to debrief? I waited an hour before responding. I'm available at 10. Tuesday morning, the meeting was different. Smaller. Just Stephen, Diane, and me. No performance, no panic. Just 3 people discussing how things would work going forward. Diane walked through the proposed structural changes. My role would report directly to her office. Any compliance-related projects would require my sign-off before reassignment. We'd bring in Dr. Yao Chen, a semi-retired CRCP Helena had recommended, as a quarterly external auditor and backup certification resource. Stephen listened. Nodded. Signed the paperwork without argument. When Diane finished, he looked at me. I owe you an apology. I didn't understand what your role actually entailed. That's on me. Okay, I said. Not forgiving, not cold. Just acknowledging. Moving forward, I'd like to understand better. Maybe we could set up a monthly briefing where you walk me through compliance requirements and how they map to our operations. I considered that. It was a reasonable request. More than that, it suggested he'd actually learned something. That works. First Monday of each month? Perfect. After the meeting, Diane pulled me aside. Your contract amendments are ready for signature. Take a look, make sure I didn't miss anything. I reviewed the document that afternoon. It was comprehensive. Structural protection for my role. Clear reporting lines. Explicit veto power over compliance-related reassignments. And a termination clause that required 6 months' notice and general counsel approval, effectively making me untouchable without executive-level consensus. I signed it. Felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. The next few weeks established a new rhythm. Stephen actually showed up for the monthly briefings, asked intelligent questions, started understanding why compliance documentation looked the way it did. Mallory went back to marketing and stayed there. And Wesley Burke started copying me on legal reviews earlier in the process, before language got finalized. Dr. Yauchin came in for her first quarterly review in March. She was a small woman in her mid-60s with sharp eyes and zero tolerance for nonsense. She spent 3 days reviewing our entire compliance framework, interviewed key staff, examined our documentation processes. Her final report was blunt: "You've been holding this place together with duct tape and prayers. I'm honestly impressed it hasn't collapsed already. But the new structure is sound. Keep maintaining it." She pulled me aside after the formal presentation. "Helena told me what happened in December. With the VP and the policy project." "She did?" She was impressed. "Said you handled it perfectly, let the system demonstrate its own failure instead of trying to explain it in advance." "Smart strategy." "I wasn't trying to be strategic," I said. "I was just tired of being invisible." Dr. Chen smiled. "Sometimes those are the same thing. You built infrastructure that couldn't be ignored once it wasn't there. That's better than any amount of arguing or explaining." She was right. But it felt strange hearing it stated so plainly. 6 months later, the January audit happened. The regulators showed up with their checklists and their skeptical expressions. They reviewed our operations, examined our documentation, interviewed key personnel. The final audit report came back with 0 violations. 0, and that was testimony to my work, and that's all I need and ever wanted.